Oyster here with an episode of Chordplay, and this is the chords of Blue Oyster Cult. And of course, Blue Oyster Cult is a world famous, classic rock band from the 70s, and then their career extended into the 80s and the 90s, and they're still active. They're actually on tour right now, and I think they just played a show up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and also over in New York too. And it's really interesting to notice a band that's had this long career path, and albums and tours and personnel changes and different styles and directions for the group, and Blue Oyster Cult's no exception. And I've always been a fan. As soon as I heard that song and Don't Fear the Reaper and Burning for You and a lot of their hits, I liked it. And then Donald Roeser, which most people know him as Buck Dharma, he's a great guitarist, very tasteful and melodic, killer riffs and cool licks, and he's always experimenting with different tones and effects, and really forward-thinking guitar player. Back in the day when I played with Dan Talion, back in the 90s, we actually opened for Blue Oyster Cult. So I got to meet these guys. There's some autographs. There's like the BOC logo. There's Alan's signature and a few other band members. And somewhere in my archives, I couldn't find it in time for this lesson, but I do have a photo of me with Buck Dharma at that show. And, it was back when I was a Wookiee and I had long hair and, I was wearing like sunglasses or whatever in the picture. But you can see he's signing an autograph for me, and I'm standing next to him just cheesing, like freaking out. One more interesting, factoid I'm going to add to this lesson was Blue Oyster Cult's manager, Sandy Pearlman. And Sandy, managed Blue Oyster Cult. He helped him get a record deal. He named the band. He actually named Donald Buck Dharma. And he also gave everybody in the band, like a nickname. What was it? Jesse Python, Andy Panda, Prince Omega and Laverne and all these strange names. And the only person in the band that kept his name was Donald. He kept Buck Dharma, and he still uses that nickname to this day. But their manager, Sandy Pearlman, also managed Black Sabbath, and he eventually managed like Aldo Nova, in the 80s, and some new wave groups and stuff. But Sandy kind of had the vision, and he named the group Blue Oyster Cult. He gave the band members nicknames, which kind of reminded me of Spinal Tap a little bit, with the makeup and the persona or whatever, like in the airport scene from Spinal Tap. But when I read all of that, and I realized like there's this crazy backstory and this kind of occult connection, and Sandy Pearlman was trying to make like an American version of Black Sabbath, which became, Blue Oyster Cult. I had no idea. I didn't know any of that history, and I thought that is really interesting. And so I read more about it and listened to their music, and it's interesting. So if you're wanting to tap into an area of, rock history that maybe you're not that familiar with, check out Blue Oyster Cult's history. I was really interested and kind of captivated by it. I thought, I want to learn more. And who's this Sandy Pearlman person? He sounds like this very eccentric, I guess he was a music critic and a producer and manager, but really interesting story. The opening then, of course, was Godzilla from the album Spectres, and I've always loved that song. And the riff, it's very appropriate for a song called Godzilla. It's this heavy kind of just, crushing kind of a power chord riff, and it reminds me of, this giant monster, stepping on cities and people and things. But the interesting thing is he's using delay, and you can hear the chord kind of repeat as he's playing the riff. And he's also using vibrato, which I'm a big fan of adding vibrato to chords, if it's done tastefully. But there's some interesting things you can do with just kind of wiggling your fingers, and you can almost kind of mimic the sound of the delay they used just with your left hand. Just power chords, but there's some interesting things that he's doing, kind of wiggling his fingers, add a little bit of vibrato. Obviously the delay is kind of adding to it too, because it sounds like this. As far as what you're hearing as far as chords, but he didn't play it that way. He's letting the delay kind of fill it out. Really interesting, and that's a sinister riff too. That prog throbbing, kind of heavy, sound. Really cool. Up next we have the song ETI, which stands for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And it's from the Agents of Fortune album, which is that one. That also has Don't Fear the Reaper. And it's an interesting riff. It's got this kind of blues rock, kind of feel. But he's doing, a really interesting thing with some chords in the beginning. Something like this. So there he's hitting like an E major chord, and then he's playing an A over C sharp here, and then he's also letting the low E ring, so it's kind of an A over E, but there's also this A over C sharp, kind of shape hiding right there. So he's kind of mixing those two chords like that, and I really like that sound. It's a very common sound. You can hear a lot of songs that have that. Single note riff, which Buck is a master at these cool little slinky, single note riffs and ideas. Something like that. The next example comes from the song Transmaniacon MC, which I believe stands for Transmaniacon Motorcycle Club. I'm not really sure. That's what the internet told me. I thought it was like a rapper, like a DJ or an MC, and then I was like, oh wait, Motorcycle Club. So that's before, before hip hop and MCs took over. But this is an interesting riff because he's starting off with a D minor 7, and he's kind of scratching it up a little bit. And then it has this crazy like little chromatic single note run. And when I first worked on this riff, I thought, man, that chromatic part is actually a really good fret hand challenge, or kind of a workout or an exercise you can play around with. But it looks like this. And there you can see we're just kind of bashing that D minor 7. And then you're doing... I'm not really sure how Buck, actually fretted that. I just chose to use as many fret hand fingers as possible and make it more of a challenge. He might just be using 2 fingers. But you don't want to do it that way. Challenge your hand. And I love taking riffs and ideas like that and making it a physical challenge where it's like, okay, I see an easy way to play it. Let me try to play it a hard way, and challenge myself. And definitely Buck is a master at those kind of riffs. Because the very famous, Cities on Flame with Rock and Roll, from the same album, their first album, that has, primarily a single note riff. Just screaming for attention. It's like, man, that's a cool riff. No chords really. It's kind of F sharp minor blues scale based. But Buck is really good at delivering these memorable and really catchy, riffs and ideas. Okay, everyone, start your cowbells. Here's Don't Fear the Reaper. Now, that's a very famous guitar part, of course. That song is wickedly famous. You can hear it on classic rock radio, of course, the Saturday Night Live skit. There's a whole bunch of, movies and, culture references to that song. And Blue Oyster Cult definitely has always had this kind of connection to the occult. Not the cult, like the band, but the occult. And, unlike bands like Sabbath and some other groups that kind of dabbled in like the, late 60s, early 70s with the occult and black magic and witchcraft and all this kind of stuff. I mean, Zeppelin and Jimmy Page were very well known, for kind of dipping into the occult, and Aleister Crowley and stuff. Obviously Ozzy, with Sabbath, and later, with Randy Rhoads, like Mr. Crowley and some of those songs. But with Blue Oyster Cult, they almost always had kind of a sense of humor about it. Like, they didn't really take it that seriously. They would add it to the lyrics, and they would kind of add it to some of the visuals, like album covers and their logo and stuff like that. But they weren't really occult members, you know what I mean? Like, they weren't walking around with robes and all that kind of stuff. They just kind of used it as part of their shtick or their gimmick. But with this song, which is arguably, their most famous song, there's a common tone. It's that open G. So it's kind of doing like that A power chord and then kind of flirting with A7. But then you have that open G on every chord. It's in the A, it's in the G, and it's also in that F, which that'd be like an F sus2 technically. And that common tone, it catches your attention. Your ear hears that, and you hear the same note. You hear the same note with each chord. It's really interesting to hear that. And that's a really useful thing that you can use, especially if you're writing songs or coming up with a chord progression or some parts. Try to have some common tones, some shared notes, between your chords, because it's kind of connecting them or linking them together with that common tone or that common sound, which in this case is that G. I think that's part of the reason why that riff is so catchy, because your ear just keeps hearing, that open G string. Okay, up next we have the song Nosferatu, which is from the album Spectres. And this is interesting. It starts with this kind of almost a spaghetti western or kind of a Tarantino sounding thing in the beginning with just the E minor chord. And then he starts doing this weird kind of chromatic, chord progression. And I turned it into kind of a physical challenge once again, or a fret hand, challenge. I'm not really sure how Buck technically plays that part, but I went ahead and just kind of made an executive decision like, okay, I'm going to turn that into an exercise too. So even if I'm playing or learning something that's kind of simple or easy, I always find a way to try to challenge myself if I can. And anyway, it looks like this. We started with an E minor chord, and he's really just kind of cleverly picking through it. And then he starts doing this. And you can actually relate those to chords, like that's an E power chord, or E5. And then this would be like an E minor 7, technically. And this would be an E6 sus2. And then this would be an E augmented flat 9. Because you've got the raised 5th and also that flat 9, that F note. Which is ugly. But then you can see I was actually using every fret hand finger as a bar, and just kind of barring those two notes on the A and the D string like this. Really interesting and an unusual, guitar part, but I like it. The last example comes from the song I Love the Night, which is also from Spectres, and I really do like this intro part. It's interesting, and there's not a whole lot going on, but there is kind of a subtle little thing happening between these two chords, and I want to kind of talk about this. So it looks like this. So right there in the beginning, he's actually playing part of a C. And then it comes down D. Then he goes back into that C again. And he kind of slides off to an E. So technically what's happening, because if you listen to the song, you'll hear like the bass is prominently playing a C note over that intro part, and it doesn't deviate from C. So he's technically playing C major, and then he's also playing a D over C, technically. So when you start blending those two chords together, you know, it has a really cool sound. You know, you can do something like that in open position if you wanted to. But you can definitely hear he kind of shifts during that lick. And that you know, kind of prompted me to fret it like this, where you can kind of, you know, move from that C to that D. So I'm not really sure if he played it this way, but that's how I kind of arranged it. And then even that little single note thing that he adds at the end, you could actually turn that into a chord part too, something like this. So anytime I learn a song, especially if it's something I haven't played before, I break it apart and I play with it and I look at what's going on. And it's like, okay, there's C, and then like a C over D, you know, technically. And that kind of made me think about, you know, the song a lot differently too, once I actually broke it apart and kind of noticed, you know, what was happening there. I love doing that, you know, just kind of, you know, playing what's there, but then also really kind of getting my hands dirty and just, you know, experimenting and trying different things. Okay, that's going to wrap this look at the chords of Blue Oyster Cult. And definitely I'm a fan. You know, I love any, you know, classic rock band with progressive, you know, tendencies or this kind of different approach. And, you know, they're a really unusual group, you know, or weird, as some people might put it. You know, their songs are strange, the titles are odd, the lyrics are a little weird, you know, and it's just one of those groups that's kind of an acquired taste. Either you love it or you don't really like it. And a lot of people, a lot of my friends, they love Blue Oyster Cult just because it is different. It's not the same old thing, you know. It's radically different than a lot of the other groups from that time period. And I think that's why I like it, because they're a little strange, you know. Normal is kind of boring. I like strange oddities and weirdness, you know. But anyway, leave some feedback and some comments. Please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content material. Thank you.